The morning sun painted the ancient stone walls of Westminster Abbey in shades of gold and amber. Outside, thousands of people lined the streets, their faces pressed against the barriers, hoping to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. The air buzzed with anticipation, thick with whispered conversations and the occasional cry of a baby in the crowd. Everyone knew something special was about to happen, though most didn't understand just how significant this moment would become. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere felt different than usual. The clergy moved with careful precision, adjusting flowers, checking microphone levels, and ensuring every pew cushion sat perfectly aligned. This wasn't just another royal event. The Archbishop himself had arrived an hour early, his normally steady hands trembling slightly as he reviewed his notes for the 7th time. Senior palace officials whispered in corners, their expressions mixing excitement with concern. The royal motorcade appeared in the distance, 3 black vehicles moving slowly through the London streets. Police motorcycles flanked them on both sides, their sirens silent but their presence commanding respect. As the cars approached the Abbey, the crowd's murmur grew into a roar. Phones lifted into the air, everyone desperate to capture the moment, to prove they were there when history unfolded before their eyes. The first car stopped. A royal protection officer stepped out, his eyes scanning the surroundings with professional intensity. Then the door opened and the crowd fell silent. Prince William emerged first, his tall frame unmistakable even from a distance. He turned and extended his hand back into the vehicle. Catherine appeared next, her grace evident in every movement. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing extravagant, nothing that would draw attention away from the real purpose of their visit. But it was what happened next that made the crowd hold its collective breath. William reached into the car and carefully lifted out their youngest child, still an infant bundled in a soft cream blanket. Catherine held the hands of their 2 other children, helping them step carefully onto the pavement. The older children looked around with wide eyes, taking in the massive crowd, the ancient building, and the weight of the moment they were too young to fully understand. A woman in the front row of the crowd began to cry. She couldn't explain why. Not really, but tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched the young family stand together at the entrance of the Abbey. Her emotions spread like wildfire through the gathering. Within moments, dozens of people wiped at their eyes, overcome by something they couldn't quite name. The family began their walk toward the Abbey entrance. William kept one hand protectively on his wife's back, while cradling the baby in his other arm. Catherine held both children's hands, bending occasionally to whisper something reassuring to them. Their middle child, barely 4 years old, seemed confused by all the attention. The eldest walked with careful steps, trying to copy their father's composed demeanor, but clearly overwhelmed by the spectacle. As they reached the great doors, a hush fell over everything. The massive oak doors, centuries old and bearing the weight of countless royal moments, swung open slowly. The sound echoed through the courtyard, a deep groan of ancient hinges that seemed to acknowledge the significance of who was entering. Inside, the Abbey revealed itself in all its magnificent glory. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadows above. Stained glass windows cast colored light across the stone floor in patterns that had repeated themselves for generations. The scent of incense and old wood filled the air, familiar and eternal. The clergy formed 2 lines leading from the entrance deep into the Abbey. Each member stood with hands clasped, heads slightly bowed in respect. As the royal family entered, they began a low hum, a traditional greeting reserved for only the most sacred occasions. The sound grew, filling the vast space, vibrating through the stone itself until it felt like the entire building was alive with reverence. Catherine's composure faltered for just a moment. Her eyes glistened as she looked down at her children, then up at her husband. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, a silent conversation between 2 people who understood they were walking into something far larger than themselves. The baby stirred in William's arms, letting out a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the echoing space. Their eldest child stopped suddenly, frozen by the magnitude of it all. The rows of people watching, the soaring architecture, the weight of tradition pressing down from every direction. Catherine knelt beside the child, her dress pooling on the ancient floor, and whispered something. Whatever she said worked. The child nodded, took a deep breath, and continued walking, hand gripped tightly in their mother's. They moved deeper into the Abbey, their footsteps clicking softly against stone worn smooth by centuries of similar journeys. Every eye followed them. In the pews, dignitaries and common citizens alike sat transfixed. Many had attended countless royal events, had witnessed coronations and weddings and state funerals. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way those grand spectacles never could. An elderly woman in the fourth row clutched her purse to her chest, tears streaming freely down her wrinkled cheeks. She had attended this abbey as a girl, had stood in almost this exact spot when the current queen was crowned decades ago. She had thought nothing could match that moment's power, that sense of witnessing something eternal. But watching this young family walk past, seeing the vulnerability and strength mixed together in their careful steps, she realized she was wrong. History wasn't just about crowns and thrones. Sometimes it was about parents bringing their children into a sacred space, trying to give them something meaningful in an increasingly complicated world. The family reached the center of the abbey and stopped. They stood together, a small island of connection in the vast space. The baby chose that moment to cry, a loud, insistent sound that would have been embarrassing in any other context. But here, in this moment, it felt perfect. It reminded everyone that beneath all the ceremony and tradition, these were real people. A real family experiencing real emotions and real challenges, just like everyone watching. William gently bounced the baby, his movements practiced and natural. Catherine kept her hands on the older children's shoulders, anchoring them, giving them something solid to hold on to as the weight of where they stood began to sink in. And in that moment, as light streamed through stained glass and ancient stone bore witness, everyone present understood they were seeing something rare and precious, not a performance or a duty, but a genuine family moment playing out in one of the world's most historic spaces. The silence that followed felt holy, thick with meaning that words could never capture. And in that silence, the real story was just beginning to unfold. The Archbishop stepped forward from his position near the altar, his ceremonial robes whispering against the floor. His face showed years of service, deep lines etched around his eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through countless moments of joy and sorrow. He had presided over royal weddings that captivated the world, had delivered sermons to prime ministers and presidents, but as he approached this young family, his hands trembled with emotion he couldn't quite control. He stopped a respectful distance away, giving the children space, understanding instinctively that they needed time to adjust to their surroundings. The eldest child peeked out from behind Catherine's dress, curiosity beginning to overcome nervousness. The Archbishop smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his formal appearance into something warm and grandfatherly. He had grandchildren of his own and knew exactly how to put young ones at ease. William adjusted the baby in his arms, and as he did, the blanket fell slightly away, revealing a tiny face scrunched in concentration. The baby's eyes opened, taking in the filtered light and the faces of strangers, processing this new world with the serious expression that babies often wear. Several people in the front pews leaned forward unconsciously, drawn to that universal human response to seeing new life. Catherine knelt down between her two older children, bringing herself to their eye level. She pointed upward, directing their attention to the magnificent ceiling that soared above them. The children's faces tilted back, mouths forming small circles of wonder as they took in the intricate stonework, the carved angels, the sense of something vast and ancient protecting them from above. She spoke to them quietly, her words too soft for anyone else to hear, but her intention was clear. She was teaching them, helping them understand the significance of where they stood. In the pews, people watched this simple act of parenting with rapt attention. A mother 3 rows back wiped her eyes, remembering similar moments with her own children. Those precious times when you try to pass on something important, something that matters, hoping they'll remember and understand when they're older. The man beside her, a decorated military officer who had stood unflinching through countless ceremonies, found himself swallowing hard against unexpected emotion. The middle child suddenly broke free from Catherine's gentle hold and took several wobbly steps forward, drawn by something no one else could see. Perhaps it was the light streaming through a particular window, or the gleam of gold on the distant altar, or simply the innocent curiosity of a child too young to be afraid. Catherine rose quickly but gracefully, ready to retrieve her adventurous offspring, but William touched her arm gently. "Wait," his expression said. "Let's see what happens." The child wandered a few more steps, tiny shoes clicking against ancient stone, heading toward the Archbishop. The old man remained perfectly still, allowing the child to approach in their own time. When they reached him, the child looked up, studying his face with the brutal honesty only children possess. Then inexplicably the child smiled. The Archbishop's eyes filled with tears that he didn't bother to hide. He placed one weathered hand gently on the child's head in a gesture of blessing that needed no formal words. That simple moment broke something open in the watching congregation. The tears that people had been holding back began to flow freely. A businessman in his 50s buried his face in his hands. A young woman clutched her boyfriend's arm, overcome by beauty she couldn't articulate. An elderly couple held hands, their fingers intertwined with the comfort of 50 years together, both understanding they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary experience. Catherine moved forward to collect her wandering child, but her own composure was cracking. She had maintained perfect poise through countless public appearances, had smiled through scrutiny and criticism, had carried herself with the grace expected of her position. But here, watching a holy man bless her child with such genuine affection, watching her family stand in this sacred space, the careful armor she wore began to crack. William saw it happening. He knew his wife's expressions better than anyone, could read the subtle shifts that meant emotion was rising faster than she could control. He stepped beside her, the baby still secure in one arm, and with his free hand he found hers. Their fingers intertwined, and in that moment they weren't future monarchs or public figures. They were simply two people overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were experiencing, grateful for each other's presence. The oldest child noticed their parents holding hands and immediately reached up to grab Catherine's other hand. The middle child, still standing near the Archbishop, saw this chain forming and hurried back to complete it, grabbing William's free hand with both of their small ones. And there they stood, a family circle connected and complete, while hundreds of witnesses forgot to breathe. The Archbishop raised his hand, ready to begin the formal proceedings that had brought them there. But before he could speak the scripted words, something unexpected happened. From somewhere high above in the organ loft that few ever noticed came a single note. Pure and clear, it rang through the Abbey like a bell. Then another note joined it and another until a melody emerged that everyone recognized. It was an old hymn, one that grandmothers sang and children learned in Sunday school. Simple and profound in its message about love and family, and the bonds that tie us to something greater than ourselves. The organist hadn't been scheduled to play yet. This wasn't part of the program. But she was a woman of 70 who had played this instrument for 40 years, who had felt every emotion this Abbey had witnessed soaking into her bones through countless services. When she saw that family standing there, hands linked, tears on their faces, she couldn't help herself. Her fingers found the keys and the music poured out, giving voice to what everyone felt but couldn't say. William's shoulders began to shake. He was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. The baby in his arms sensed the emotion and began to fuss, but he held on, whispering soothing sounds while his own tears fell. Catherine turned her face into his shoulder, her other hand still gripping their oldest child's, her body shaking with sobs she had held back too long. The children looked up at their parents with confusion mixed with understanding. They didn't know why everyone was crying, but they felt the emotion, the way children always do. The oldest began to cry too, not from sadness but from empathy, from feeling their parents' feelings. The middle child wrapped arms around William's leg, holding tight to something solid in a moment that felt too big. In the congregation there wasn't a dry eye remaining. Strangers turned to each other, sharing tissues, sharing the burden of this overwhelming emotion. A photographer assigned to document the event lowered his camera, unable to capture this through a lens, unwilling to create distance between himself and this raw, beautiful moment. His own tears would blur the viewfinder anyway. The music swelled, filling every corner of the Abbey, rising up through centuries of stone to the very heavens themselves. And in its embrace, this young family stood together, small and vulnerable and absolutely radiant. They had come here for formal reasons, for duty and tradition and ceremony. But what was happening now went beyond any of that. This was about being human, about feeling deeply, about allowing yourself to be broken open by beauty and love, and the weight of connection that binds families together across time and space. The Archbishop let them have this moment. He stood with his hands folded, his own face wet with tears, and simply bore witness. There would be time for formal words later. Right now, this family needed to simply be, to feel whatever they were feeling, to stand in this holy space and let themselves be overwhelmed by its grace. The music faded slowly, each note reluctant to leave the sacred space it had filled. As the last echo died away, a profound stillness settled over the Abbey. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, pregnant with meaning, heavy with the weight of shared experience. No one moved. No one wanted to break whatever spell had been cast over this ancient place. Catherine straightened first, releasing William's hand to wipe her eyes. She pulled a tissue from somewhere in her dress, a motherly preparation that made several women in the audience smile through their tears. She dabbed at her face carefully, trying to compose herself, but her hands were shaking. She looked at William, at their children, and fresh tears threatened to spill over. She laughed softly at herself, a sound of surrender, acknowledging that she couldn't hold it together even if she wanted to. William reached out and gently took the tissue from her hand. With infinite tenderness, he wiped a tear she had missed from her cheek. It was such a simple gesture, something married couples do thousands of times, but witnessed here in this moment, it carried the weight of devotion that transcends circumstance. He smiled at her, that private smile that was only hers, and she smiled back, both of them red-eyed and vulnerable and more beautiful for it. The baby had fallen asleep during the music, tiny head resting against William's chest, completely at peace despite the emotional storm swirling around. William looked down at the sleeping infant, and his expression transformed into something almost painful in its tenderness. Here was his child, so small, so new to the world, already part of something so much larger than themselves. He bent and placed the softest kiss on that small forehead, a promise and a prayer wrapped into one simple gesture. The Archbishop finally spoke, his voice rougher than he intended, still thick with emotion. He didn't deliver the formal opening he had practiced. Instead, he said simply, "Welcome. You are home here." 4 words, nothing elaborate, but they carried truth that resonated through the vast space. This place, built by hands long turned to dust, maintained by generations who understood its importance, existed for exactly this. For families seeking connection to something eternal. For people looking for a place where their deepest feelings could be acknowledged and honored. Catherine nodded, unable to speak, and the Archbishop understood. He gestured toward a special area that had been prepared, a small corner near the altar where cushions had been placed, where the children could sit if they needed to, where the family could gather in slightly less formal arrangement. William and Catherine guided their children toward it, moving slowly, still adjusting to the emotional weight they were carrying. As they walked, their oldest child suddenly stopped and turned to face the congregation. The child's eyes swept across the sea of faces, taking in all the people watching, all the emotion still visible on their features. With the wisdom that children sometimes possess, the child waved. It was a small gesture, fingers wiggling in greeting, but it shattered the remaining tension in the room. People laughed and cried simultaneously, waving back, grateful for this moment of lightness, this reminder that joy and sorrow could exist in the same space. They reached the prepared area, and Catherine carefully helped the children settle onto the cushions. She smoothed hair, adjusted clothing, whispered instructions about sitting still and being quiet. Normal mother things, the same things mothers had been doing in this abbey for centuries. William sat beside them, still cradling the sleeping baby, positioning himself between his family and the watching world, a protective instinct as old as fatherhood itself. The Archbishop began to speak, his words carrying across the abbey with practiced ease. He spoke of faith and family, of the bonds that connect us to each other and to something greater than ourselves. He spoke of the responsibility that comes with blessing, of the way grace flows through generations from grandparents to parents to children, an endless river of love and hope. His words were beautiful, chosen carefully to honor both tradition and this specific moment. But even more powerful than his words was the way the family received them. William listened with his whole body leaning forward slightly, his attention completely focused despite the baby in his arms. Catherine had one hand on each of her older children, an unconscious gesture of connection, while her eyes never left the Archbishop's face. She was drinking in his words like water in a desert, finding in them confirmation of something she had always felt but couldn't articulate. In the congregation, people listened with similar intensity. A young mother in the back row held her own sleeping infant, seeing herself reflected in Catherine's careful attention to her children. A grandfather near the front thought of his own grandchildren, wondered if he had done enough to pass on what mattered, felt grateful for this unexpected reminder of what truly matters. A teenager who had come reluctantly, dragged by parents, found herself unexpectedly moved, understanding for the first time why her grandmother insisted on taking her to church, what all of this was supposed to mean. The Archbishop paused in his speaking and made a gesture. 4 members of the clergy stepped forward, each carrying something wrapped in white cloth. They moved with ceremonial precision, years of practice evident in every step. But their faces showed the same emotion everyone else felt. They weren't just performing a ritual. They were participating in something that mattered. The first cloth was unwrapped to reveal an ancient prayer book, its pages yellowed with age, its binding cracked but still intact. The Archbishop took it reverently and held it up for all to see. He explained that this book had been present at countless royal christenings, that it had witnessed the blessing of generations, that the very pages held within them the prayers of people long gone, but not forgotten. He placed it carefully on a small table beside the family, adding their story to all the stories that had come before. The second cloth revealed a silver bowl, simple in design but profound in purpose. It had held holy water for 200 years, had touched the foreheads of princes and paupers alike, had been part of the most sacred moments in countless lives. The Archbishop poured water into it from a crystal pitcher, each drop falling with a sound that echoed like a heartbeat. Catherine watched the water fill the bowl, her eyes following each ripple, each circle expanding outward, and she understood the symbolism. What happened here would ripple outward too, touching more lives than she could imagine. The third cloth held anointing oil, blessed by hands more holy than the Archbishop's, prepared according to recipes passed down through centuries. The scent of it filled the air as the bottle was opened. Myrrh and frankincense and other spices that carried memory in their fragrance. Several older members of the congregation inhaled deeply, transported suddenly to other ceremonies, other moments when this same scent had marked transformative occasions in their lives. The fourth cloth revealed something unexpected. Instead of another ceremonial object, it held a simple wooden cross roughly carved, showing its age and wear. The Archbishop held it with special care, his hands trembling slightly. He explained that this cross had been made by a monk 500 years ago, carved during long hours of prayer, touched by thousands of faithful hands seeking comfort or strength, or simply connection to something beyond themselves. It was plain, unadorned, worth nothing in monetary terms, but worth everything in meaning. He handed the cross to William, who took it with appropriate reverence. William looked at it for a long moment, running his thumb over the worn wood, feeling the grooves and imperfections that made it real and human and holy all at once. Then he handed it to Catherine, who held it just as carefully, just as reverently. Without speaking, they both understood. They would pass this to their children someday, would tell them about this moment, would try to help them understand what they were feeling now. The oldest child reached up, curious, wanting to touch the cross. Catherine lowered it carefully, allowing small fingers to trace the wood, to feel the weight of history and faith and all the prayers that had been whispered while holding it. The child looked up at their mother, questions in young eyes, and Catherine smiled, knowing that someday she would have answers, that someday this child would understand. The baby woke suddenly, letting out a sharp cry that shattered the reverent atmosphere. William immediately began the automatic soothing motions, bouncing gently, whispering soft sounds. But the baby was not to be comforted so easily. The crying grew louder, more insistent, echoing off stone walls with startling volume. William looked apologetic. Catherine moved to help. Both of them suddenly very much just parents dealing with a fussy infant, the weight of ceremony temporarily forgotten. But the Archbishop laughed, a genuine sound of joy that surprised everyone. He moved closer to the family and looked down at the crying baby with delight. "A voice in the wilderness," he said, loud enough for all to hear, crying out for attention, demanding to be acknowledged. How appropriate. How perfectly, wonderfully appropriate. His laughter was contagious. The congregation joined in, relieved, grateful for this moment of humanity. This reminder that even the most sacred moments include messy, real, human elements that cannot be scripted or controlled. The baby's crying gradually softened to whimpers as William found the right rhythm of movement, the right pressure of hand on back, the practiced comfort that comes from months of sleepless nights and learned patience. Catherine produced a small toy from her bag, something soft that rattled gently, and the infant's attention shifted, small hands reaching for this new distraction. Crisis averted, but the moment had done something important. It had broken through the last remaining barrier between ceremony and reality, had reminded everyone present that this wasn't a performance. It was life, messy and unpredictable and real. The Archbishop invited the family to stand, and they rose together, helping the children up, making sure everyone was steady. He asked them to approach the font where the silver bowl now rested, filled with holy water that caught and reflected the colored light streaming through the windows. They moved as a unit, careful steps that honored the solemnity of what was about to happen, each parent keeping a protective hand on the children who flanked them. William handed the baby to Catherine, and she received the small bundle with practiced ease, settling the infant against her shoulder where the child immediately nuzzled into her neck. Content now. Peaceful. William placed his hand on Catherine's lower back, that instinctive gesture of support, and together they faced the Archbishop across the ancient font. Their older children pressed close to their legs. Sensing the importance of this moment even if they couldn't fully understand it, the Archbishop began the traditional words, phrases that had been spoken here thousands of times, in voices long silenced but somehow still present in the echoes of the stone. He spoke of water and spirit, of washing away and beginning anew, of promises made not just by parents but by the entire community gathered to witness. His voice carried the weight of every ceremony he had ever performed, every vow he had ever blessed, every prayer he had ever lifted to heaven on behalf of others. Catherine shifted the baby in her arms, preparing for what came next, and her hands were shaking again. William noticed and covered her hands with his own, steadying them, steadying her. She looked at him with such gratitude, such love, that several people in the front rows had to look away, feeling like intruders on something too intimate for witnesses, even though witnessing was exactly why they were there. The Archbishop dipped his hand in the holy water, and droplets fell back into the bowl with small sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed space. He raised his wet hand and held it above the baby's head, water dripping down his fingers, catching light, looking for all the world like liquid diamonds falling through space. He began to speak the blessing, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying meaning built up over centuries of repetition and belief. As the first drops of water touched the baby's forehead, the infant's eyes went wide. Not crying, not upset, just surprised and somehow aware that something significant was happening. The little face scrunched in concentration, processing, and then relaxed into acceptance. More water fell, running down the small forehead, and the baby remained calm, peaceful, as if understanding at some level beyond words that this was right, this was good, this was meant to be. Catherine was crying again, silent tears that streamed down her face unchecked. She made no effort to wipe them away, both hands occupied with holding her child, but also perhaps understanding that these tears were part of the offering, part of the prayer being spoken through water and blessing in the presence of everyone gathered. William's jaw was clenched tight, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, his hand pressing firmly against Catherine's back, grounding himself through touching her, through feeling her solid presence beside him. The Archbishop finished the blessing over the baby and paused. Then, in a departure from the expected ceremony, he turned to the older children. He knelt down to their level, ignoring the discomfort to his aging knees, making himself small so he could meet them eye to eye. He dipped his hand in the holy water again and looked at the oldest child. "May I?" he asked simply, seeking permission, treating even this small person with the dignity of choice. The child looked at their parents, seeking guidance, and Catherine nodded encouragement. The child turned back to the Archbishop and nodded too. The old man smiled and gently touched the child's forehead with wet fingers, speaking a quiet blessing that was just for this one young soul, words chosen specifically for this particular child. The gesture was so tender, so personal, that it felt like everyone watching should look away, but no one could. He did the same with the second child, asking permission, receiving it, offering blessing that was unique and specific and given with the fullness of his attention and care. Both children stood very still, sensing the importance, feeling the weight of adult attention focused completely on them in a way that rarely happened in their busy lives. When he finished, both children looked different somehow, standing a little straighter, their faces reflecting a seriousness beyond their years. The Archbishop stood with difficulty, his knees protesting, and William instinctively reached out to steady him. For a moment, the future king supported the elderly holy man, and something passed between them, some understanding that transcended their respective roles. The Archbishop placed his hand on William's shoulder, looked directly into his eyes, and spoke words meant only for him. Whatever he said made William's face crumple, made his careful composure finally break completely. He bowed his head and his shoulders shook with sobs he could no longer contain. Catherine shifted the baby to one arm and wrapped her other arm around her husband, holding him while he cried, being his strength while he allowed himself to be weak. The older children watched their father cry, confused and concerned, and Catherine somehow managed to radiate calm assurance to them, even while supporting her husband and holding the baby. Women in the congregation who were mothers themselves recognized this supernatural ability to be everything to everyone simultaneously. This skill that mothers develop out of necessity and love. The Archbishop stepped back, giving the family space, and gestured to the congregation. Without instruction, people began to stand. Row by row, they rose to their feet in a wave of movement that rolled from back to front. They stood in solidarity and support in recognition of what this family was experiencing. They stood as witnesses, but also as participants, as people who understood that blessings are not individual affairs, but communal acts that require the presence and acknowledgement of others. A woman in the choir section began to sing, her voice rising pure and clear without accompaniment. It was a hymn about grace, about being held when you cannot hold yourself, about the way love carries us through moments when we are too overwhelmed to walk alone. Other voices joined hers, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The Abbey filled with sound, with voices raised in harmony, with music that was both ancient and utterly immediate. William lifted his head, tears still streaming, and looked around at all the people standing, all the faces watching with compassion and understanding. Catherine leaned into him, the baby between them, their older children pressing close, and together they stood in the center of this outpouring of communal support. They were not alone. They had never been alone. This vast network of witnesses and supporters and believers surrounded them, held them, carried them when the weight became too much. The singing continued, verse after verse, and slowly the family's crying eased, not because the emotion had passed, but because it had been acknowledged and honored and shared. The burden had been distributed among hundreds of people willing to carry a piece of it. This was the real meaning of ceremony, the real purpose of gathering in sacred spaces, not just to observe ritual, but to share in the weight and joy and sorrow of being human together. As the final notes of the hymn faded, the Archbishop raised his hands in the traditional gesture of blessing. He spoke over the family, over the congregation, over the very stones themselves, words of protection and hope and promise. He spoke of the future, of the children growing strong and wise, of the parents finding strength in each other and in something greater than themselves, of the community continuing to gather and support and witness for each other through all the moments yet to come. William and Catherine bowed their heads, accepting the blessing, their children copying the gesture with varying degrees of understanding. The baby, still cradled between them, looked around with alert eyes, taking in this strange new world of light and sound and emotion, beginning the long process of making sense of human experience. When the Archbishop lowered his hands, signaling the end of the formal blessing, no one moved. The moment felt too fragile to break, too precious to rush past. They stood frozen in time, family and congregation together, holding space for something that could not be captured or contained or adequately described, only experienced and remembered and treasured. The Archbishop gestured toward a side chapel, a smaller, more intimate space within the great abbey. It had been prepared earlier, candles lit and flowers arranged, a quiet place where the family could have a moment of privacy before facing the crowd outside again. William nodded gratefully, understanding the gift being offered. They needed time to collect themselves, to transition from this overwhelming experience back to the roles they would have to play for the cameras and crowds waiting beyond the ancient walls. As they walked toward the chapel, their footsteps echoing softly, people in the pews began to move, but they didn't rush for the exits. Instead, they formed a line quietly and without direction, creating a pathway lined with human presence. As the family passed, people reached out, not touching but extending hands in gestures of blessing and support. Some whispered words, others simply nodded, but each face reflected the same message. We see you. We honor you. We stand with you. Catherine paused beside an elderly woman whose weathered hands were clasped in prayer. Their eyes met, and in that exchange something profound passed between them. The old woman had lived long enough to understand what Catherine was feeling. The weight of responsibility mixed with fierce love, the fear of failing these precious children, the hope that you're doing enough. She smiled at Catherine with such knowing compassion that Catherine had to stop, had to acknowledge this connection with another human who understood. William waited patiently, the baby now awake and alert in his arms while Catherine took the old woman's hands in hers. No words were spoken. None were needed. The older children watched this exchange, sensing its importance even if they couldn't articulate why it mattered. When Catherine finally released the woman's hands and continued walking, she carried something with her, some piece of wisdom or strength or simple human kindness that had been freely given. They reached the chapel and stepped inside, the heavy door closing softly behind them, muffling the sounds from the main abbey. The space was small, intimate, lit by dozens of candles that cast warm, flickering light across stone walls covered in centuries of prayers scratched by desperate or grateful hands. The air smelled of beeswax and flowers and time itself. William immediately sank onto a bench, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. The emotional toll of the ceremony had drained him completely. He cradled the baby against his chest, rocking slightly, taking comfort in the small warm weight of his child. Catherine sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and pulled the older children onto her lap, all of them a tangle of arms and legs and connection. They sat in silence for long minutes, just breathing, just being, allowing the enormity of what they had experienced to settle into their bones. The baby made small sounds, content explorations of vocal cords. The older children fidgeted but stayed close, sensing their parents needed them near. Through the thick door, they could hear the muffled sounds of the congregation beginning to depart, footsteps and voices fading as people returned to their ordinary lives, carrying with them the extraordinary experience they had shared. Catherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it would feel like this. William turned to look at her, seeing the wonder and confusion and lingering emotion on her face. I thought it would be formal, ceremonial. I didn't expect to feel so much. Her words came slowly, trying to process, trying to understand what had happened to her in that vast space surrounded by witnesses. William shifted the baby to one arm and reached for her hand with the other. Neither did I, he admitted. I've been to dozens of ceremonies here, hundreds probably, but this was different. He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. Having them here, our children, seeing them in this place that holds so much history, so much meaning. It made everything real in a way it never was before. The oldest child squirmed around on Catherine's lap to look up at her face. Why was everyone crying, Mummy? The question was asked with genuine confusion, no judgment, just the honest inquiry of a young mind trying to make sense of adult emotions. Catherine smiled and brushed hair back from the child's forehead, buying time to formulate an answer simple enough for understanding but true enough to matter. Sometimes, she said carefully, when people feel something very strongly, it comes out as tears. Not sad tears, but happy tears, grateful tears. Tears because something is so beautiful or so important that our hearts get too full and need to let some of the feeling out. She looked at William, checking if her explanation made sense, and he nodded encouragingly. Were you happy? The child asked, and Catherine's eyes filled again because yes, she had been happy, deeply happy, but also so much more than happy. Overwhelmed, grateful, terrified, awed, humbled, blessed. So many feelings tangled together that calling it simply happiness seemed inadequate. But happiness was close enough for now. Very happy, she confirmed. Very, very happy. The child seemed satisfied with this answer and turned back around, settling more comfortably on her lap. The middle child had grown quiet, thumb finding its way to mouth in the way it did when processing big feelings or needing comfort. Catherine adjusted her position to support both children more comfortably, and they sat like that, a family pile of warmth and connection, while candles flickered and time passed at its own gentle pace. William looked down at the baby in his arms, studying the small face with the intensity parents reserve for their sleeping children. Every feature seemed miraculous, evidence of grace he didn't deserve but received anyway. He thought about the blessing that had been spoken, the prayers that had been offered, the community that had gathered to witness his child being welcomed into something larger than one family. The responsibility of it pressed on him, but differently than before. Not as a burden, but as a calling, a purpose, a reason for being that transcended his own desires or fears. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A voice called quietly that the crowd outside was growing, that perhaps it was time, that the world was waiting to see them. William looked at Catherine and saw his own reluctance reflected in her eyes. Neither wanted to leave this quiet sanctuary, this place where they could just be a family without the weight of public expectation. But they both knew duty required them to return to those roles, to smile and wave, to allow themselves to be photographed and discussed and analyzed. Catherine stood carefully, settling the children on their feet, smoothing clothing and wiping faces with that automatic mothering instinct that fixes appearances even in emotional moments. William rose too, the baby stirring but not waking, and together they faced the door that would return them to the world beyond this sacred space. They looked at each other, a long look that communicated volumes, and William reached out to cup Catherine's face in his free hand. "We can do this," he said, and she nodded, believing him because she had to, because their children needed them to be strong, because the people waiting outside deserved to see them composed and graceful. Together, she agreed, and in that word was their marriage vow renewed, their partnership reaffirmed, their commitment to each other and to these children and to the roles they had been born or married into. They arranged themselves, Catherine taking the baby so William could hold both older children's hands, and together they approached the door. Catherine took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders, lifting her chin, becoming before their eyes the poised public figure the world expected to see. William did the same, his posture straightening, his expression settling into the pleasant, composed mask he wore for cameras. Only their eyes, if you looked closely, still showed the emotion of what they had experienced inside these walls. The door opened, and they stepped back into the main abbey where a few officials waited to escort them out. The transition was jarring, moving from intimate privacy to public spectacle in the space of a few steps, but they managed it with the practice of years. The children, sensing the shift, became more subdued, more careful, modeling their parents' sudden formality with the adaptability of young ones who have learned to read adult expectations. They walked back through the abbey, retracing their earlier path, but everything looked different now. The space that had been filled with emotion and witnesses was largely empty. Echoing returned to its usual state of patient waiting. A few people remained, clergy members cleaning up, officials making notes, but the energy had changed. The sacred moment had passed, and now came the return to ordinary reality, to schedules and obligations and the endless demands of public life. As they neared the great doors, they could hear the roar of the crowd outside, amplified by the stone tunnel of the entrance. The sound grew louder with each step, a wall of noise and expectation waiting to greet them. William's hand tightened around his children's, and Catherine pulled the baby closer. They paused just inside the doors, taking one last moment in shadow before stepping into the light and chaos of public attention. The doors swung open and the roar became deafening. Thousands of voices crying out, cameras clicking in a continuous thunder, the press of humanity pressing against barriers as everyone surged forward for a better view. The sunlight was blinding after the dimness of the abbey, and all four members of the family squinted against its brightness, momentarily disoriented by the assault on their senses. But something unexpected happened. As the crowd caught sight of them, as people registered their red-rimmed eyes and the visible traces of the emotion they had experienced, the character of the noise changed. The excited shouting softened. The aggressive surge forward eased. A hush began to spread person to person, row to row, as thousands of individuals suddenly understood they had witnessed something profound, not just ceremonial. William and Catherine stood at the top of the abbey steps, holding their children, and for a moment, they simply looked at the crowd. They didn't wave or smile their practiced smiles. They just stood, allowing themselves to be seen as they actually were, vulnerable and moved and still processing what had happened inside those ancient walls. It was a gamble, this honesty, this decision to not immediately don the masks of public performance. but it paid off in ways they couldn't have anticipated. A woman near the front of the crowd began to clap, slow and rhythmic. Others joined her, the applause building gradually, respectfully. Nothing like the frenzied cheering that usually greeted royal appearances. This was different, more like the applause at the end of a moving performance, recognition that something meaningful had been witnessed. It spread through the crowd, thousands of hands coming together in acknowledgement and support. Catherine felt tears threatening again and blinked hard against them. She had to maintain some composure now, couldn't fall apart completely in front of the cameras that were broadcasting this moment around the world. But the genuine warmth of the crowd's response touched her deeply. These weren't just subjects dutifully showing respect to royalty. These were human beings connecting with other human beings, responding to authenticity with authentic emotion of their own. The baby chose that moment to wake fully, letting out a loud cry that was captured by every microphone and camera pointed their direction. Instead of embarrassment, Catherine felt a surge of love so strong it nearly buckled her knees. This was her child, her family, her real life playing out in front of the world. She began the automatic rocking motion, and the crowd watched as she soothed the infant with practiced ease. Countless mothers in the audience recognizing and respecting the universality of the action. William crouched down beside their older children, bringing himself to their eye level, speaking quietly to them while the crowd waited patiently. He was telling them they would wave now, would walk to the car, would go home soon. He was being their father first, their protector, their guide through this overwhelming experience. When he stood and took their hands again, the oldest child looked up at him with such trust, such complete faith that whatever was happening was okay because Daddy said so, that several people in the front rows had to wipe their eyes again. They began to descend the steps, moving slowly, carefully, conscious of the children's shorter legs and the need to maintain dignity while also being safe. Halfway down, the middle child stumbled slightly, a small trip over their own feet. Nothing serious, but enough to cause a moment of imbalance. William immediately steadied the child, kept them from falling, but the crowd gasped collectively. Thousands of people simultaneously worried about this small person they had never met, but suddenly cared about deeply. When it was clear the child was fine, that no harm had been done, an audible sigh of relief swept through the gathering. People laughed at themselves, at their own overreaction, but also at the realization of how invested they had become in this family's well-being. A child they didn't know had stumbled, and thousands of hearts had lurched in concern. What was that if not love? What was that if not community? They reached the bottom of the steps where their vehicle waited, door already open, protection officers standing at attention. But before entering, Catherine turned back to face the crowd one more time. She shifted the baby to one arm and raised her other hand, not in the usual royal wave, but in a gesture of thanks, of recognition, of shared experience. The crowd responded with renewed applause, with shouts of love and support, with an outpouring of genuine affection that was rarely seen in these carefully choreographed public appearances. William helped the children into the car first, making sure they were safely settled and buckled, then handed the baby to Catherine, who was already inside. He turned to the crowd himself, and on impulse he did something no one expected. He placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, a gesture of humility and gratitude that was completely unscripted, completely genuine. When he lifted his head, his eyes were bright with unshed tears again, and he mouthed two words that lip readers would later confirm: "Thank you." Then he climbed into the vehicle. The door closed, and they were cocooned suddenly in relative quiet and privacy. The children immediately became louder, the careful public behavior falling away as they returned to being just kids. They asked questions, made observations, complained about being hungry. Normal, beautiful, ordinary childhood chaos that made both William and Catherine laugh with relief. The vehicle began to move, slowly at first, navigating through the crowd, then picking up speed as they left the Abbey behind. William and Catherine looked at each other across the space between their seats, both holding children, both exhausted and wrung out and somehow more connected than they had been before. They had been broken open together, had allowed themselves to be vulnerable in a way that terrified them, and they had survived it. More than survived, they had been blessed by it. Catherine leaned her head back against the seat, the baby content now in her arms, and closed her eyes. She thought about the old woman who had held her hands, about the Archbishop's tears, about the music that had filled the Abbey like a living thing. She thought about all the faces in the crowd, the strangers who had stood witness to their family's most intimate moment, who had held space for their emotion with such generosity and grace. William watched his wife, seeing the peace settling over her features despite the exhaustion, and felt his own heart expand with feelings he didn't have adequate words for. He looked at his children, at these small people who carried within them the future of something larger than any individual family, and felt the weight of responsibility but also the lightness of hope. They would be okay. They would raise these children with love and intention and the support of people they had never met but who cared anyway. As London passed by the windows, as they left the historic center behind and headed toward home, something had fundamentally shifted, not in the world perhaps, but in them. They had walked into that Abbey as people doing their duty, fulfilling their roles, checking off another obligation in an endless list of public appearances. They were leaving as something different, transformed by the unexpected gift of genuine emotion shared in sacred space, by the reminder that beneath all the titles and protocols and public expectations, they were simply human, simply a family trying to do their best. The baby fell back asleep, lulled by the motion of the car. The older children continued their chatter, already processing the experience in their own ways, building memories they wouldn't fully understand for years to come. And William and Catherine sat in comfortable silence, not needing words, just grateful for this moment of peace, this bubble of privacy before they would have to face the next obligation, the next appearance, the next demand on their time and energy. But they would carry today with them. When things got hard, when the pressure felt like too much, when they questioned if any of this mattered, they would remember the Abbey filled with tears and music. They would remember the Archbishop's blessing in the old woman's hands and the crowd's genuine response. They would remember that they were not alone, that they were held by something larger than themselves, that love and grace and human connection were real and powerful and worth every sacrifice. The car turned into the palace gates, and their brief moment of privacy was ending. Staff would be waiting, schedules would need to be addressed, and the machinery of their public life would grind forward as it always did. But something had changed. They had been to the Abbey, had allowed themselves to break open, had been witnessed in their humanity and found worthy of love anyway. That was the blessing, the real one, beyond any religious ritual or ceremonial words. They had been seen and held and blessed by the simple presence of people who cared. As they stepped from the car, children in hand and baby against heart, they carried that blessing forward into whatever came next, into the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones, into the daily challenge of being parents and partners and public figures all at once. They had been to the Abbey and they had been changed by it, and that was enough.